inequality is in many ways manifested in our spaces, in our buildings, in how we create our cities. And I wonder if, can architectures play a role in what Sir Michael has been talking about, being maybe a process for creating together with local community more fair and more equal places and spaces?
Yes, I think this is a highly important task to address. I think that realizing the just cities globally has a lot to do with how resources are distributed. So planning is definitely a great tool to distribute resources, where we locate them and how we make access to different amenities, resources, etc. And it also illustrates power relations. So if we combine the different disciplines, saying that taking into account where people with fewer resources lives, and carefully look at these areas and see how accessibility to different resources play out, we can definitely prioritize these areas much, much more and make sure that more resources and amenities are accessible for those areas, and then we will strengthen the local opportunities.
Okay, Gautam, I know you have an interest in and work with planning theories and practices in the Global South. And I saw a lecture by you that intrigued me. Are there lessons to learn also for the Global North in different ways of thinking about planning in the Global South, perhaps?
Well, I think they very much are in a couple of ways. I mean, one I would think is that if you look at urbanization and the production of urban space in cities of the South, it allows you to imagine a much more interesting set of actors who produce space. You go beyond just the state and the market as we currently understand, and realize that a large amount of urban space in the South is built by people directly. It's managed and repaired and run by, we've been talking about communities and agency. And I think that Southern urbanism has the possibility of thinking about what a people-led or a community-led production of space looks like. Even though we have to recognize that a lot of that comes at the cost of the kind of inequality and inadequacy that Sir Michael was talking about, right? So it's not, I think we have to be careful that getting communities to participate cannot mean that the state abdicates its responsibility for playing its part in the production of that space. And that space between not using resilience as a way to abdicate responsibility is a really important balance we have to find. But I want to say just one thing briefly, also just in response to Sir Michael's really interesting comments, is to add only, I think that when we look at health or other forms of inequality, I think sometimes we are not asking enough of the question of how social inequality undergirds the kind of income and human development inequality we're talking about. Who bears the brunt of that inequality is, I think, very important, not just spatially. But if you look at the kind of current mobilizations around race in North America, around caste and religion in South Asia, to contexts that I know, the question of social inequality has to be re-forefronted. Because I think we're talking a lot about the material and the economic, but it's rooted in very deeply held social prejudice and discrimination that we have to bring back to the conversation.
Mm-hmm. So, Michael, would you like to perhaps respond to Gautam's?
Oh, I agree with Gautam completely on both these major points. Take the second one first. When I talked about my 6 domains of recommendations, it wasn't just money. Money is important, economic inequalities, but social inequalities are important. And we have good examples where, because of social organization, the link between economic deprivation and poor health has been broken. So that I think, as I said, that health is an outcome of social processes, and inequalities in health are outcomes of inequalities in social processes. But the link between economic deprivation and poor health can be broken by social action. And that's Gautam's first point. He talked about development of urban spaces, but communities organizing can have an enormous role. I began by saying the Minister of Finance has a big role to play. And I don't want to let him off the hook. The Minister of Finance and other ministers are very important, not to let them off the hook. But we can see, and Gautam will know this, my education on this came from the Self-Employed Women's Association in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad. What a voluntary community organization of self-employed women can do when government's not doing things, what a well-organized non-governmental organization can do in getting women organized to improve the quality of their lives, and good health will be a result of that.
The topic of this talk is tackling inequalities. Edward, at the same time, and we have heard this also in an earlier session, that in a sense, inequality or differences in resources is sort of a necessary evil, perhaps, of how we can understand cities. How do you see that? Or yes.
So it was Plato who wrote in the Republic that any city of whatever size is in reality two cities. One, a city of the rich, the other, a city of the poor, and they are perpetually at war with one another. Cities are unequal, not necessarily because of bad things about cities, but often because of good things about cities. That cities attract the rich because they're relatively fun places to be rich, and they attract the poor because they're more palatable places to be poor. Life is a little bit less hellish. And so while I share strongly the imperative made by Sir Michael and by Gautam for fighting inequality on a global and national scale, at the local level, often what looks like equality is just the fact that you haven't made any housing for poor people, right? You've zoned out the poor and you've created the sort of false equality of the bedroom suburb that makes it impossible for anyone who isn't part of the crowd of insiders to come in. Now, the inequality of cities is only tolerable if cities are performing their historic function of turning poor children into middle income or wealthy adults, right? If we think about sort of all of the callings of what we expect from urban areas, there's no one that is more important than enabling this economic transformation, whether or not it is in the slum of Dharavi or in Dorchester in Boston. That is in some sense the critical task of the urban economy. And unfortunately, too many cities are failing at that. Now, in the US, I think this is primarily an issue of education, and education that is targeted for economic needs of poor kids to enable them to find their space in the economy of the 21st century. But there are also ways in which health interacts with education in a really important way. And certainly what Sir Michael talked about in terms of the enormous health disparities within a metropolitan area are just striking, right? You can go from a 10-minute subway ride can move you 10 years back in terms of life expectancy, in terms of neighborhoods of New York. And it's a really shocking and awful thing. Part of the challenge there is that in many cases, these health disparities are particularly linked to behaviors. And it's hard to think about how you change the behaviors in a way. So eating practices, smoking practices, obesity. It's hard to think about how you change that without sort of really addressing inequities in society on a really grand scale. And I think above all, education is our tool on that, although there are other tools at the same time. The last point I want to emphasize is that this pandemic has been a remarkably unequal pandemic. Pandemics have often been unequal, right? The Florentines who fled to Fiesole in Boccaccio's Decameron, they were relatively wealthy young people, and they were using their wealth to escape. But I don't think we've ever seen inequities in terms of health on this scale in past pandemics, where essentially for the US data, there was no increase in mortality among the richest Americans in 2020. All of the burden of death came among the poor because the rich were able to telecommute, they were able to isolate themselves. And so I really share Sir Michael's hope that we sort of remember that this is a moment to ensure that we empower those people throughout the world who start with fewer resources.
All right, so Gautam, do you see, we don't see necessary contradiction here at all, or?
No, I think I mean, I think the question that Edward is making about the possibility of intergenerational mobility is where we sort of see this in the same way. I'm wary of still thinking about a notion of structural inequality as something that is also about the dynamism of cities, because I think it understands an economic model where competition drives innovation. And I think there are many other ways in which that kind of dynamism can result, including through public investment. And I think if you look at some of the recent work on the history of innovation out of Europe, a lot of it is about not that question of the dynamism of push and pull, but actually about very concrete infrastructural investments. And I think one of the examples I would say is one of the lessons that's really stayed with me from what Edgar Peterson was saying earlier as well is if you look at informal work, and Sir Michael was talking about employment as a social determinant, but work in the informal economy is a very particular kind of work within the social determinant framework. And I don't think we have understood well enough how to, for example, hold the delivery of health-based social protection for informal workers, because so much of the way we understand the social determinants comes from the notion of industrial full employment. It comes from a very different cultural experience of urbanization in Europe and North America. This is not the story of our urbanization. South Asian urbanization is almost delinked from manufacturing and industrialization. And it means that we have to think differently about the drivers of that urban economic framework. I would like to think differently about the role of inequality. But on the question of mobility, I think Edward and I would very much agree.
All right, Anne, maybe would you want to respond? Otherwise, I have another question also.
Well, I can link to that because I think it's highly important what you bring up here in relation to inequalities is the question of urban segregation. And I think that inequalities are definitely important in that sense. And the life chances, if life chances are worse in areas where you have fewer resources, it will be even a worse situation in the end. So if we, through either planning but also through policy, make sure that the life chances and the local opportunities are even better, and that we are also more dependent on collective resources in those where you don't have your private economy perhaps that strong. So all institutions like schools and culture houses or other amenities are highly, highly important for empowering people also.
I have one question also regarding some symbolic aspects of inequality or equality, and I know you have an interest in that. How much does more symbolic aspects of architecture, for example, play?
Well, to a large extent, actually, the architecture also we heard in the presentation earlier today that all societies have buildings as symbols of something, that you want to reproduce something. And of course, if you do buildings, for example, community house, if they are present, it's actually something, it fosters our dreams. And make new possibilities. So of course architecture in that sense is very, very important, and what they symbol. Or if you build only poor housing, poor education and schools, etc., then of course you signals that children are not important, or that these people living in this area are not important, etc.
Does anyone, because of the symbolic or the focus on the symbolic, would anyone like to comment on that very briefly?
I wanted to say something about Gothenburg.
Okay, thank you.
If I might, at Gothenburg. Picking up Glaeser's point about the importance of education and early childhood. On one of my visits to Gothenburg, my host said, we wanted to put up a sign at the airport on your arrival, Gothenburg, read to your children. And that we privilege in Gothenburg the importance of early child development and reading to children. And in fact, the meeting that I came to, so it started well, I was totally inspired by this. And the meeting that I came to was a meeting of employees of the city of Gothenburg, deliberating together on what a socially sustainable Gothenburg would look like in the future. And there were 1,000 people in the audience. And I thought, that's amazing. That's not how our civil service works. We get directives from on top that tell you how it's going to be. And that so-called consultation means it's put out for 2 weeks, and then they say we consulted and we continued to do what we were planning to do in the first place. And the idea of engaging 1,000 employees of the city in a conversation that begins with reading to children as a way of creating a socially sustainable Gothenburg. Now, I know somebody else's city always looks better than one's own, but to me, that's inspiring.
Thank you, Sir Michael. Great ending to this talk. Thank you.